So this is a great question. In a world with so many distractions and voices, how do I stay focused on God? Other ways of life seem sometimes more appealing than living with God. And I think when you're asking this question, the next question you need to ask is, well, what does it mean to focus on God? What does it mean to have a connection with God? How do we actually maintain this idea, this thing that is such a big part of our life as Christians, especially when there are these other things pulling on us and trying to get us to come in different places, like you're saying. Life, sometimes other ways of life seem more appealing. So how do we actually fix that problem? My first question would actually be, how do you pray? Like, how often do you pray? Because when I think about it, a couple things come to mind, and I'll walk you through them here. The first one being, how often do you pray? Is it something that you incorporate in your life? How does it feel when you pray? Is it more of something that is mandatory that you have to do, or is it something that you want to do? Because there are a bunch of things that happen, but this also becomes a way of life. So we need to make it a constant in our lives, really, so that no matter what happens, He's in the center of it with us and He's in the middle of it with us. We also need to remember that sin separates us from God. And so we're going to constantly we were one way, now we're the other way, but we used to be constantly separated from God. Like everything was separation. There was no way we could get to God. And Jesus came and fixed that. He fulfilled that gap. He's the bridge through that gap that now we can go and we can have closeness to God. We're no longer separated from God. But that means that we're still going to struggle with our flesh sometimes because we still live in broken bodies in a broken world. And really now, it's just our own guilt that's keeping us from connecting with God. Because if you are living and He says these things about you in the Bible, which are true, if these things are true about you, then why are you feeling this way where it's different? Why do you have these pulls and these draws to these other places? I want to get a little more into detail into this still, because there's one really big reason, one really big question that I want to answer at the end of explaining this for you. We need to stay close to God by having Him as a constant in our lives. Sin keeps us separate from God because of our own guilt, and because before it was because we were separated because we were sinners, and He's holy and He cannot be near sin. He cannot be around sin. But now we don't have that separation from Him. And so any separation from Him in our heads as Christians, if we believe the words of the Bible, the gospel, why do we still feel this? And the answer actually comes if you go and read the book of Psalms. This is super cool when we look at how amazing it is that David, all the things that he did, is still counted as a man after God's own heart. And when we read so I love the book of Psalms, okay? I love Psalms because of all of the things. I'm a musician, I'm a poet myself, and so I relate to David in a lot of ways. And he and I are also very similar in the type of person that we are, okay? And then on top of that, you get all of these books before the book of Psalms. You get all these books talking about David and David's life, all the way from like Ruth and Boaz through Hannah, who is Samuel's mother, and then you get to David. Samuel anoints David, and that's the entire story of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. That's like 4 books of just straight up one main storyline. And it's not all about David. And so we're reading this and we finish that, and you're just like mind blown when you get to the end of these books. But when you get to the end of these books, you're seeing what was before David, David's life, and then after David, and how all of the things went down after David. And then eventually you get to the book of Psalms, and you're reading and you're like, wow. And you get an inside look into David's emotions, into his feelings, into what he's thinking, how he's perceiving the world. And it's crazy because he's actually talking about all of the same things that we're talking about here. Literally exactly the same. And so when we look through, and by the way, this is also really cool. You read book of Psalms and it's immediately followed by the book of Proverbs. David and his son Solomon were so different. David was very much an emotional person. He was a very big, expressive person in what I would call an abstract way. Solomon is a very concrete, philosophical person. And so there are these two very dynamically different personalities who are writing these amazing things. You get knowledge and you get wisdom from the wisest man to ever live, King Solomon. And then you get these emotions and you get these writings of David and how he's feeling and all of these emotings in the book before. So that's David and then his son. And they're very different, but they're so complementary. We see how dark it felt for David for so many things. It was just endless darkness. He was being chased across the countryside, hiding in caves from his father-in-law. Like his father-in-law was chasing him through the Israeli country, just trying to kill him. That would be very depressing if you're sitting in a cave, you're writing, you've got your group of outlaws with you, and your father-in-law, the king of Israel, is coming after you just because he's mad at you and jealous of you and wants to kill you. Doesn't really feel like God is with you in that moment. But he knows that he is, and he calls. He doesn't really feel it, but he knows it, and you see that when he's calling to God. I'm looking at my Bibles over here. He's calling to God, and he's saying all of these things. And so it makes sense for us when we look at our lives now in the ways that we have to interact with the world now. We have to be in the world, but not of it. And that's very hard to do. And David had to remember that he was in the world, but he was not of the world. Because the world around him was falling apart really fast. But the world that he was a part of was not falling apart. He preludes to Jesus so many times. A lot of his writings prelude, and we see them used in the New Testament when people are talking about Jesus. And so it becomes this amazing difference where we know something even if we don't feel it. Because feelings, they go up and down. This is something that I struggle with a lot. This has even been difficult for me this week, where I might feel kind of blah, right? Like last week was a long week for me. Last week was a very difficult week, but I know these things that are true even in the midst of uncertainties here in this life, even in the midst of chaos and things in this world that are calling me to different places. We live in a sea of constant and underlying yet direct messaging to us as young men. And as young men, we have all these different things that are vying for our attention. And I just did a conversation with Jim Ramos, amazing podcast that is not out yet, but it will be. In there, we talk about a lot of this stuff, because he's got this viewpoint as someone who is older, who has been a young man and now is a father who is watching his own sons grow and become full-fledged men. And he can walk us through, having lived it himself and having shepherded men through this journey who are his sons. We talked about a lot of this stuff. That was an amazing conversation, and it's going to come out soon. But for now, we have to remember that God knows our struggles. Yeah, for brokenness, there is healing. For sadness, there is joy. But sometimes it is easier said than believed. And so we have to just remember to believe it, even if we're not feeling like believing it. There are tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of times in the Bible where people don't feel it, and because they're not vibing with it, they go crazy. They go way off what they should be doing. And it always causes problems for them. When you walk away from God, it causes problems. Duh, like we didn't know that already. But yeah, it's true. There are a ton of things. Yeah, it's true. There are a ton of things in this world that do seem more shiny, and even other religions, they seem more shiny than what is actually being presented in the gospel and in the Bible, because there's different viewpoints inside of different religions, and then there's the different religions themselves, and then you have denominations of religions, and it's all just ways of confusing and trying to break down what is true, because the lies are very loud and the truth is often quiet. And so we have to really be quiet and still in our brains and listen. And emotions are very loud. They're very loud, and they cause a lot of chaos inside of our heads, inside of our physical bodies. There's a lot of tie-in between our physical bodies and the emotions that we feel. And so we have to remember that we need to quiet these things, kind of like drain them out of our heads, so that our heads have space to remember what it is that's actually true, what's actually real. Right? Good, pure, true, noble, right, lovely, those things. Think about those things. And that is the gospel. When we remember the gospel, we remember, oh, God has got us regardless. And that creates peace. And that helps us to say, okay, I don't need to be worrying about these other things that are calling to me that might seem more appealing, because it's not always going to feel good. David did not feel good. There were times that Solomon didn't feel good. The process that they had to go through, by the way, to get Solomon onto the throne, David had to do, and he was old, he was about to die, and still they had to do a lot of stuff and a lot of wiggling to get Solomon on the throne because of what had happened, all the chaos inside of David's family that he had caused from his sins, and that the things were just happening. Like there was a lot of craziness between Solomon and his other siblings, and so he had to get Solomon on the throne for the sake of Israel, because he knew Israel was going to crumble if that wasn't the way that it was going to work. So he knows our struggles. How do we remain close to him in a world that is strong, in a relationship that is strong and unbreaking, inside of a world that is so crazy and insane. We have to read the Bible, firstly, reading the Bible, and then praying, because that's how we connect. That's how we converse with God. If you want God to speak to you, go read the Bible, and then you speak back to God in prayer. And sometimes He'll speak back to us in prayer, but that is a very direct way of hearing from God. People are like, oh, I heard this, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't care. Go read the Bible. And that's a concrete way of actually hearing from God, because that is His words directly to you. It was written with us in mind. It wasn't written for us, which is something to keep in mind. It was written for the Israelites. That's who the Bible was written to, not who it was written for. It was written for all of us, with all of us in mind. All of us, the same exact words apply to every single human being on earth. But it was written to, the wording, the timing, the context was all in the frame of. So, read your Bible constantly. It's God's living word, and it is ever present and flowing through our hearts and minds. We need to keep it in mind. Like I was saying, the book of Philippians says to keep all these things, whatever is good, pure, true, noble, lovely, admirable. I don't think I got all of those in the right way, but that's what we need to be remembering, okay? Because remember, Solomon, David's son, he says, above all else, guard your hearts, for everything you do flows from it. And Paul says, writing in Philippians 1:27, whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of Christ. And by doing these things, we can live in the world, but not of it, because we're living in the world that is ultimately God's world, but that has been destroyed and encircled by the craziness. And then we can come to a point where we're saying, okay, we're living with a direct connection to God, even amidst all of these crazy things that are happening. And that is how we actually stay connected to Christ and to God in a world that is so absolutely crazy. So yeah, it's an amazing question that we do have to keep in mind, and it's so difficult for us, but that episode does come out. Hopefully that's going to be one of the next episodes that comes out. And let me know what you guys think about this as well. What are your thoughts and opinions on living for God, remembering that even if you're not feeling it, He's always there? Because a lot of us are losing track of what we've learned and what we know to be true when we go to places like college, when we realize that the church experience we had wasn't the most formative for us. It was built on feelings, and when feelings fade, that causes a lot of problems. So what do you guys think? What's your opinions? Let me know in the comments below, and subscribe if you have not already. I'll see you next time.